And now on WRS, Michael McKay with the McKay Interview.
Hello, everyone. One of my great interests, mainly because I lived in Switzerland, getting on now for 36 years, is the bilateral relationship in all its richness between the United Kingdom and Switzerland. When one looks at the map of Europe over the past, say, 1,000 years, riddled with wars and conflicts, there are not so many countries that have never been in a state of military conflict with England, Britain, or the United Kingdom. But one of them is Switzerland. There are many reasons why, and maybe that could be the theme of another program. Today's radio conversation is not to delve into past military history that did or did not happen. Rather, it's to talk about one of the most enduring of cordial relationships between two unlikely countries. One, an island off the northwest coast of the continent, this precious stone set in the Silver Sea, as Shakespeare described it. The other, landlocked, with an average height of sea level of 1,350 meters, that's over 4,000 feet in old money. Switzerland's average puts Ben Nevis, Britain's highest, and a few meters shorter than Switzerland average, into humble context. Switzerland has some of the world's most majestic mountains and beautiful valleys and lakes, is at the very heart of Europe, and as if that were not enough, speaks 4 languages to boot. Well, who better to talk to me, to all of us, dear listeners, in this, our final McKay interview of an extraordinary year, one we're probably all glad to see the back of, and the Swiss ambassador to the United Kingdom, or to give him his official title in the UK, the ambassador from the Swiss Confederation to the Court of St James's, His Excellency Mr Alexandre Fasel. Good morning, Your Excellency. Thanks for making time for me and all our listeners to the McKay interview across Switzerland, in the UK and beyond. And I wish I was in London with you rather than having to deal with Skype.
Hello, Michael. Good to see you again, and thank you for the invitation.
Ambassador Fasel, you must have one of the great jobs in global diplomacy. Many must be envious of you, including me. Now, you've been in your post for just over 3 years. Before that, you held a variety of important posts in Swiss diplomacy, including Deputy State Secretary at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs in Bern, Permanent Representative of Switzerland to the United Nations Office and other international organizations at Geneva, which is when we first met, Deputy Ambassador in Australia. I know that you're a lawyer by professional education, and you come originally from the bilingual canton of Fribourg, and in fact were raised in a bilingual French and German-speaking family. I'd like to start our conversation by talking about the peoples of our two countries, the important and long-lasting relationship between the Swiss and the British, what some people have said and written about them over the years, what your personal experiences have been, and your thoughts about that relationship as a Swiss, the most prominent Swiss, living in the UK. Then we can talk about trade, commerce, winter sports, clocks, watches, and all the other objects and activities that come to mind when one thinks of Switzerland and Britain. But Ambassador, just listen to these interesting quotations that I found. I have often wondered that a country situated almost in the middle of Europe, as Switzerland is, should be as little known. That was Abraham Stanion, a former British envoy, a diplomat, to Bern, writing in 1714. And listen to this one. No country is more frequently visited but less known. And that was Jonathan Steinberg, an American historian and writer, writing in his book in 1976, Why Switzerland? And lastly, my good friend Christopher Long, British ambassador in Bern from 88 to 92. And before that, the UK Deputy Permanent Rep to the UN in Geneva, 1980 to 1983, speaking on this program in 2016 about what it was like being the British ambassador to Switzerland, your role in reverse. Former Ambassador Long told me, and I quote him, a very, very healthy, friendly, polite relationship. People in England did not really appreciate what Switzerland did. Everybody knew it was a friendly, historic country. Many of them, back in London, did not realize that our trade with them, the Swiss, was larger than with Saudi Arabia, with all that oil. Now, Ambassador, knowledge of the British by the Swiss, and conversely, knowledge of the Swiss by the British has improved a lot since Abraham Stanion more than 300 years ago. But please tell me what your experiences have been since arriving in London now, as we're here in the first quarter of the 21st century, and tell me about how much the British know about the Swiss and Switzerland, and what is your impression? Sorry for a long introduction, but over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Michael. I'm struck by those two quotes, or the first two quotes you used by Stenion and Steinberg, and that Switzerland was little known. And I'm wondering what the explanation could be. My take is that Switzerland is a fairly small country, but then hugely diverse and very complex in terms of culture, socio-economic texture, the political system, and that on so the whole feature of the land can really change from one valley to the next, and this complexity probably is difficult to grasp, and that would probably explain why they say Switzerland is little known, because system, but we're not an evangelists. So there is this French saying, I think it comes from the Canton de Vaud, vivons heureux, vivons cachés. You know, let's have a happy life and just keep to ourselves. But of course, those quotes go back before the times when we had country branding, where people engage in country branding, which we do ourselves now. And what I see is, yes, Britons do know Switzerland according to their field of interest. So if I talk to people in Westminster, they know about this other third country in Europe they want to engage with. If I talk to people in the arts, they will know about all the musicians, visual artists, performing artists visiting these shores. Footballers will know about all the Swiss in the Premier League. All the Britons who own a place in Switzerland or regularly travel there will be able to talk about communal politics in their village. All of the Britons love, of course, Roger Federer.
Yeah. Yes, my sister's a great fan of his.
There you go. And I mean, in the city, they know their banking and insurance friends. In the high-tech galaxy of the Midlands, they know their high-tech counterparts in Switzerland. All the universities and research centers know their cousins in Switzerland that are with them at the sharp end of progress and health. In health, everybody knows Switzerland's advances in big data, real world data, personalized health. So the knowledge is, sectorially speaking, very deep and very good.
Okay, so let me move on. Let's take what you've just said as a springboard into my next question, which is why, Ambassador, do you think the two peoples get on so well together? What makes the chemistry between the Swiss and the British so successful? Tell me what your experience has been so far.
I think it's to do with this habit we share, or this characteristic we share, which is a kind of pragmatic, no nonsense, getting on with it sort of character. And on top of that, there is, I think, a mutual admiration. I think the British admire our solidity, and we admire the British craziness or the daring character. Before the British came to Switzerland, nobody in Switzerland had ever imagined that mountains were there to be climbed on as a recreation. So, so there are common features in our character, and then complementary one, which brings us together.
I see. Well, there's a lot more in that I'd love to go on, but I know that we got a lot to get through today, but I'd like to go into that craziness thing. But let's do that another time. Let me ask you this. I want to talk a little bit about two memorable icons. I've chosen them quite selfishly, and I'm sure there are lots of other icons, but one is a specific place in North London, and the other a person, or rather many women, Swiss women. Firstly, the place, Swiss Cottage in North London. I've often wondered why it's so called, and I've read the historical references, but I wanted to ask you, is there any connection or form of activity between the Swiss embassy, the Swiss community in London, and Swiss Cottage these days, or has there ever been?
No, unfortunately not. No, there is no historical link with Switzerland whatsoever. There is no Swiss community in Swiss Cottage. It goes back to the l'engouement, how do you say in English? This enthusiasm for all things alpine
Yes.
during Queen Victoria's reign. So there was this huge popularity for all that. And then a local entrepreneur wanted to capitalize on that, building on that trend, and so he established this coaching inn on the outskirts of London, which then became the Swiss cottage, and then the whole area around it,
and even an underground station on the
underground station, and this chalet type of building, it doesn't look Swiss to my eyes. But I see what they wanted to achieve. It's still there. Yes. It's still there, but I must confess it is serving Bavarian beer rather than Swiss beer.
Okay, my second icon is the Swiss au pair girl. That's an iconic figure and real. I know one, a dear friend, family friend, still living in Zug, where I used to live, who was once an au pair in Britain back in the 1950s. I spoke to her just the other day. She told me she's now a great-grandmother. She has told me more than once of her fond memories of her experiences. But were there many such women who came from Switzerland? And what significance, if any, do you attach to this significant group of young women who carried what we would now call in modern parlance brand Switzerland into the homes and families of the English or the British middle and upper middle classes for many, many years? What, in your opinion, did they do for the special relationship between our two countries? Do they still exist? And have you ever met any, Ambassador?
Oh, they do still exist, and yes, I know quite many of them, and they are the mainstay of the Swiss presence in Britain.
Really?
This au pair migration started even before the Second World War. When the war was declared, or when it was building up towards the war, Switzerland repatriated thousands of young girls back to Switzerland, and the second wave of repatriation was planned, but couldn't then be implemented because war broke out, and 800 Swiss girls stayed behind for the entire duration of the war. They never returned to Switzerland and married here, and they are, to this day, the very basis of the Swiss community in England, if you will. And then after the war, the tradition was pursued. In the 40s and 50s, there would be 4,000 to 5,000 Swiss girls coming to
my friend was one of them.
Yes, and many stayed on, married here, and lived their life here. And I have met wonderful elderly ladies who participate in proceedings of the Swiss Church and the Swiss Benevolent Societies, who come from that generation. And I fondly remember Annetta Diviani Morosi, for example, who just passed away a few weeks ago, or Helen Alexandre Fasel, who is still with us. So wonderful, wonderful ladies who have so much to share with us today.
It's a very nice story, but let's move on from that and add to that. How important, then, Ambassador, is the social and cultural relationship between the Swiss community in the United Kingdom, not just in London, and the local British population, the wider family, so to speak? Give me some examples of what you do to encourage and nurture this relationship. And by the way, how many Swiss are there living in the UK these days?
In the UK, there are around 40,000. Or that's UK and Ireland. In Ireland, I guess it's 1,500. So say 38,000 plus in the UK. Yes, culturally, we have a very close relationship in all different fields of the arts. There is a lot of activity of the Pro Helvetia, which is the Swiss Arts Council, of the Swiss Cultural Fund UK, which promotes young emerging artists, and own productions of my embassy. And as I say, we're very broad in our activity that can go from contemporary music at the Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival, which is one of the world's foremost special festivals in that field. More specific acts for example, in Dalston at Café Otto, again in the contemporary music field, but then the Edinburgh Festival and Fringe, where we have a big presence with our theatre productions. We are regularly present in the Cheltenham Jazz Festival. We had a Swiss programs in the recent London Jazz Festival. So there is a lot of activity going on, and we are now embarking in a new project, which is typical for what we try to achieve, which is very collaborative aspect. So the next project we have is, because of COVID, there are many empty shop windows across the country. So we would like to wrap shop windows with poetry written by British poets and presented and designed by Swiss graphic designers.
And this is an intention, or is this a fact?
That is the plan, and will be realized next year, 21.
I see. Okay. So let me ask you this question now, just to move on to some other things, which, I mean, you wouldn't be offended if I said that's a classic case of soft power, would you, Ambassador? What you've just been talking? No. Because they're very good, very strong examples of bringing people together.
Absolutely. It's exactly that.
Yeah. Let me ask a little bit more about trade. Give me a snapshot of our mutual importance to each other's trade balance these days. In the past, I know of great names like Wilsdorf, Ritz, Moyer, and his association with Lloyds Bank, Brunner and ICI, Jakob Schweppe, Nestle and Brown Boveri all had strong links with Britain. But what about today? On the Swiss side, what do the trade statistics comprise? Goods, services, technology? Tell me more about that, please.
Everything, as you would expect from advanced, mature, innovative economies. But what we see when we look at the figure is how huge the economic footprint we have in each other's economies. Switzerland is Britain's third largest non-EU trading partner. So the biggest trading partner of the UK is the EU with 300 billion a year, and then the United States with 125, China with 23 billion, and Switzerland in hot pursuit with 22. So we are far more important than Japan at 14 billion, twice as important as Canada or Australia. Yes. So you see that huge economic footprint, which is a very broadly based engagement in goods and in services.
I see. That's interesting. I didn't realize those numbers. I seem to remember when I read those figures years ago that this has been a consistently high number. It's not just happened recently. It's been up there for quite some time.
Absolutely. And now with Brexit, we needed to safeguard that and to solidify the legal basis of it all. The framework of it is our Switzerland's bilateral relations and treaties with the EU and Britain's membership in the EU. So once Britain left the EU, we needed to replicate that legal framework into our purely bilateral relations, which we did.
Thank you. My guest today is His Excellency Mr Alexandre Fasel, the Swiss ambassador to the United Kingdom, and we're talking to each other via Skype. Now, Ambassador, now that devolution of some political power has been a reality in the UK since around 1998, I think, and with talk in some quarters of the UK facing the possibility of breakup, or at least Scotland going its own way, please, can we just turn to this for a few moments? And I realise that such political topics are sensitive matters for an incumbent ambassador to speak publicly about. But let me ask you first to explain what you understand to be the difference between devolution and federalism, a word, federalism, I mean, that upsets many, as you must have discovered since living in London, or confederalism in the Swiss sense. You must, as the ambassador of the Swiss Confederation, the world's most successful federation, have been asked about this often. And let me put my question to you this way. Are you ever asked for advice or for your opinion, or at the minimum for the benefit of your Swiss experience when it comes to devolution or federalism?
Personally, I haven't been asked, and I can understand why, because it's to do with what we call in German Staatsphilosophie und Staatstheorie. It's all about the philosophy and the very fundamentals, how you understand statehood and the way you organize your state. And then there is a very big difference between Britain and Switzerland. In Switzerland, the state is built bottom up. It is the cantons that are the original sovereign powers who decided to pool some of their sovereignty up to the next level of the federation, or what
voluntarily, not militarily.
No, yes. So political powers and authority. So it is really a bottom up, and so federalism, in our sense, is expression of the original sovereignty of the cantons, who only give to the confederation, to the central state, what they want to give. And all the residual powers remain with the cantons. Whereas here, the reading federalism is the process mainly seen with Europe, the process of federating powers at a next level, which is a next higher level. So it is a driver towards centralism. Whereas our reading is, it is the guarantee of decentralized government.
It's a very important distinction.
And so devolution expresses then the starting point. Whereas federalism, in our sense, it is this bottom-up build-up of the state. Devolution, from, devolvere in Latin, rollover. It is deconstructing the centralized state. It is transferring powers to a lower level, especially by the central government, to local or regional administration. So the concept is a different one, whether you build up a state or whether you redistribute centralized powers to regional authorities. So that's the basic difference, and that's why I have not been questioned on that.
So let me examine you and question you a little bit more, Ambassador. Please forgive me, but it's something which always fascinates me, having lived here so long. I'll put the question to you this way. Two countries of considerably different sizes of population, one about 8 million, the other almost 70 million, one 6 times bigger than the other, both liberal, vibrant democracies with a firm belief in free markets and trade and a strong attachment to sovereignty and independence. May I ask you this, Ambassador, what in your opinion is independence and what is sovereignty? I have in mind the fact that Switzerland pays a lot of money to participate in the EU single market and by agreement adopt most of the EU's regulations. So I'm curious to know how you define sovereignty and independence and how much you pay for that market access.
That's a question. You're referring to a question which is very central for any third country in Europe that must organize its and define its relationship with the main power in Europe, which is the EU, the main power and the main market in the EU. And so it is all about the question of how you want to balance your objectives and interests in terms of prosperity with your interests in terms of sovereignty. And there what I see is that both our countries, the acceptation of sovereignty in both our countries is rather more on the formal side. You can define sovereignty as very formal, where you are technically in charge, but you can also have a definition of sovereignty as the expression of the influence you have on decisions that will directly affect your state and your affairs. It seems to me that Switzerland and the UK are rather on the formal side of the acceptation of sovereignty as a concept, and that Britain there is even stronger or more formalistic as Switzerland in terms that then will affect the kind of market access Britain has towards the single market. But this is very much, I mean, the definition of what you understand by sovereignty is a central part of sovereignty.
No,
So
I think
you can't.
I think it's illuminating to hear how you explain it. But let's continue our discussion on the EU. Now that the UK joined Switzerland outside the EU, what difference will it make to our relations and trade, in your opinion? And as a corollary, now that we're both out of the EU, will that benefit relations and trade between us, or will any mutual advantages be negligible, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, and as I just said, we needed to make sure that the framework that has brought us so far in our economic relations was safeguarded and would not suffer from Britain's exiting the EU. So we had to put in place a body of treaties that replicated what we had in our relationship through the EU. My government called that the mind the gap strategy.
Mind the gap, yeah.
Mind the gap, because there was a risk of a legal void once Britain left the EU. So we managed that, and we are pretty much in a situation where things will continue as they were so far. And my government then wants to expand on this mind the gap strategy, what we call the mind the gap plus, or the British call future relationship, where we now want to see how we can further expand our relationship. And one aspect is financial services. The Chancellor of the Exchequer and Federal Councillor Uli Maurer have issued a joint statement where they define our shared ambition of what we could be doing and want to do in the fields of financial services, where we want to negotiate an agreement which will liberalize cross-border provision of financial services based on mutual recognition of outcomes in the regulatory and supervisory field. So there is a lot of potential which we are going to exploit together.
Okay, forgive my choice of language here, but I'm just wondering if Brexit has made life difficult, if it's given you a headache as far as Swiss relations with the EU, and maybe perhaps Switzerland would have wished for something different. Has the UK's action to leave the EU muddied the water, if you know that expression, between you, Switzerland, and the EU, and the treaty relationships and delicate ongoing negotiations between Switzerland and the EU?
Yes, as you say, Switzerland is engaged in negotiations ourselves with the EU on an institutional framework agreement governing our bilateral relationship and some of our bilateral, the more important treaties we have with the EU. So I think what I can say is that the fundamentals are the same in Brexit and in the institutional framework agreement we are negotiating, in the sense it is all about questions relating to the status of third countries of Europe, countries not being part, and where you need to organize the relationship with the EU. And because at the very center, it's the same or similar questions, of course, the EU wants to give consistent answers to the two parties there. But what is realize is that the British and the Swiss are very specific situations with notable differences. And as a matter of fact, any agreement with the EU is always bespoke. So both processes are being dealt with, the British with their Brexit process and ours with the institutional agreement. Both processes are really dealt with on their own merits in an independent way.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador, predictions don't mean much these days because they're so often wrong, but how do you see the immediate years ahead, let's say 5 years, for our relationship between Switzerland and the UK? What are your priorities as you reflect on your legacy in London? I know you're not leaving your post yet, but I also know that diplomats in your high position don't usually stay longer than 4 or 5 years in such exciting positions as being ambassador to the UK. So what will you hand over to your successor as the important legacy aspects?
Yes, Michael, don't push me out too early.
That wasn't my intention.
I'm very much enjoying my posting here, and hope to be going on for some time. I feel that there is a considerable potential to build upon in our bilateral relations, and mainly based around innovation. Our shared competencies in research, in science, where we are both at the cutting edge of progress, opens interesting possibilities.
Let me interrupt you there, because you must spend a lot of time out of there. Give me one or two examples of where you've been, what you've visited that makes you feel so strong in your conviction.
I've traveled a lot around the country, but let's take the example of the Midlands.
Okay.
And there, a very specific aspect, which is what the British call motorsport valley.
Yep.
Motorsport, and Formula One especially, as the world foremost technology accelerator, is really happening here in the Midlands, but also in Switzerland. Switzerland has its very own motorsport valley. I mean by that high-end technology, advanced engineering, advanced manufacturing, performance engineering, the whole array of high-tech competence, which has been accelerated through these sporting events such as Formula One. I have used that as a vector to bring together the high-tech galaxies of Britain and of Switzerland, so that they can team up together and then in partnership penetrate commercial markets worldwide based on that technology. There is a lot of mileage in it.
And when you say you bring these people, is there an exchange of ideas, exchange of investment? Are the universities involved, the technical institutes? Across the piece, is it? Across the piece.
It is really across the piece. And what we are trying to do is really to drive then concrete partnerships that then produce business for both sides.
Last question, Ambassador, because the clock is ticking against us. What are your most memorable experiences of life? And in three places: in London W1, where your embassy and where you live, life in England, and life in the United Kingdom, because you must have been around the country quite a bit.
Oh, Michael, you need to invite me back for another program.
I will do.
Just on that question.
I promise. But give it a try, please.
I always say that the country you go to as a young adult, and you live on your own for some time, becomes your second homeland. And for my wife Nicole and I, this was Britain, Oxford, in the late 80s, when I was a researcher in international law there, and Nicole was pursuing her musical career in London. And so when we came back as ambassador, that really was a homecoming. And so it's so difficult to tell you what exactly it is and we're still totally overwhelmed by that experience. The only thing I may say is, we realize sometimes how much we have become Londoners when we just stay to our village of Marylebone. Have huge difficulties of extracting ourselves from our village and travel further afield.
You're very lucky, Ambassador. Listen, Ambassador, thank you so much for answering all my questions so fully and so candidly. I wish you and your family a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. My guest today has been His Excellency Mr Alexandre Fasel, the Swiss Ambassador to the UK. Thank you again, Ambassador.
Merci beaucoup, Michael, et joyeux Noël.
And thank you, dear listeners. I wish you too a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, as we all look forward to the arrival eventually of the vaccine, and I'll be with you again in January.
That was the McKay Interview with Michael McKay. And don't forget, you can hear that interview again on our website, worldradio.ch.